They never notice the light until they're standing in the dark. They never appreciate the warmth until winter hits. And people rarely value your presence until they have to live with your absence. This isn't because you weren't enough. It's because they never learned how to hold something rare while they still had access to it. So let's talk about it. Let's go deep. Let's peel back the psychology behind why they finally wake up, only when you're not there anymore. Let's begin. You were available. You were present. You were consistent. You poured in without being asked. You showed up in ways they didn't even recognize were special, not because you were trying too hard, but because that's who you are. You don't love halfway. You don't connect casually. You don't treat people like placeholders, options, or temporary entertainment. When you care fully. And at first, they loved it. They soaked in your warmth, like sunlight they didn't have to earn. But here's the truth most people never admit. Familiarity doesn't just breed comfort. Sometimes it breeds blindness. They got used to you. They got used to the way you gave, the way you listened, the way you understood, even what they never said out loud. They assumed your empathy was endless. They assumed your patience was unlimited. They assumed your presence was guaranteed. Because when someone is always there, people subconsciously forget that they don't have to be. They start believing that your love has no expiry date, no conditions, no boundaries, that you'll stay, even when they don't show up for you, even when they take things slow, even when they fail to pour back into you, even when they become careless with your heart. And the saddest part? They don't realize they're doing it. People don't recognize value when it's convenient. They recognize value when it becomes unavailable. Absence is clarity. Distance is education. Silence is revelation. Your absence created a void they were never prepared for. Your distance forced them to confront what they never acknowledged. When you were close, your silence echoed truths they avoided hearing. When your voice was still here, let's talk about why. When you stop showing up, something psychological happens in them. Their mind runs back. Through every moment, you held them together. Every moment you chose softness, when others chose judgment. Every moment you saw their flaws and didn't flinch. Suddenly, they realized something terrifying. No one else treated them like that. Not their past, not their rebound, not the people they left you for, not the people they distracted themselves with. No one, because what you gave doesn't come around often. And deep down, they know it. That's why the regret hits hard. That's why the memories start replaying. That's why they scroll back through old messages. Why they open your profile, but don't follow. Why they type paragraphs they never send and retype them again at 2 a.m. That's why they come back months later with lines like, I didn't appreciate you enough. You didn't deserve how I treated you. I wasn't ready for someone like you. I didn't know what I had. Of course they didn't. They were emotionally underdeveloped, spiritually unprepared, psychologically unfit for the depth you offered. You were a mirror. You reflected the parts of them they weren't ready to change. So they walked away, thinking the problem was you. And then life taught them it wasn't. They realize your value when you're gone, because for the first time in their life, your energy is no longer cushioning them. Your presence is no longer grounding them. Your heart is no longer giving without limits. Your patience is no longer protecting them from their own instability. And reality hits different when your absence makes them face things they never had to face. When you were there, your absence becomes a teacher, a mirror, a wake-up call. Because here's the truth. They didn't lose you when you walked away. They lost you when they chose not to show up. while you were still there. Your departure only revealed what was already true, and that's why they finally realize your value. Not because you became better when you left, but because distance exposes what presence hides. You were rare all along. They just finally noticed. You know what's strange? People don't truly see what you bring until they try to live without it. And once you stop showing up, their world becomes quiet in a way that exposes everything they took for granted. Not because you punished them, not because you played a game, but because absence is the one truth you cannot ignore. Because when you were there, they got used to the warmth. They got used to the reassurance. They got used to the version of themselves that only existed because you made them feel safe. But when you walked away, suddenly they had to face their own emptiness without the comfort of your presence to distract them from it. And here's what happens next. They don't miss you immediately. People rarely do. What they miss is the feeling they had around you, the ease, the emotional safety, the way you understood what they didn't know how to say. But those realizations take time. Time they didn't respect when they had you, time they didn't protect when you were giving everything. It starts small, a moment of silence, a thought that comes out of nowhere, a memory they didn't expect to sting the way it suddenly does. Then it grows. They check their phone, even though they know you're not messaging anymore. They replay your conversations, trying to find the moment they pushed you too far. They scroll old messages because what you wrote then feels more meaningful now than it ever did when you sent it. Because now it's gone. And the thing about value is this: it's always most visible in the space you leave behind. Your absence becomes a mirror that shows them the version of themselves they tried to ignore, the version that wasn't ready, the version that didn't appreciate, the version that was careless, with a heart that was sincere. See, when you were there, they thought you'd always be. Most people do. They assume your patience has no limit, your giving has no boundary, your love has no breaking point. But losing you revealed the truth. You were not permanent. You were not replaceable. You were not just someone. You were the one who made their world feel lighter. And only when you stopped carrying what they kept dropping did they notice the weight. Now they sit with it, alone, uncomfortable, unequipped, because they pushed away the very person who made connection feel effortless. And the guilt? It always arrives late, but it arrives loudly. Not because they're bad, not because they never cared, but because they thought they had more time with you. They assumed your heart was a guarantee instead of a privilege. They thought you'd keep healing them while they kept hurting you. But the day you chose yourself was the day their excuses stopped working. And that's why people realize your value only when you're gone. Because loss has a clarity love sometimes doesn't. Because silence tells the truth their pride never will. Because your absence is the first time they've truly met the consequences of their own behavior. And now they see it clearly, painfully, irreversibly. They didn't lose just you. They lost the version of themselves that only existed because you cared. And that is a loss they will feel far longer than they ever expected. They don't realize your worth when you give them everything. They realize it when your absence starts echoing louder than your presence ever did. Because distance does something that effort never could. It forces them to sit with themselves, with their choices, with their guilt, with their fear, with their patterns. And suddenly, the person who felt replaceable becomes unforgettable, not because you changed, but because they're finally seeing you without the comfort of having you right there. This is where clarity hits them. This is where regret grows roots. This is where your absence becomes the mirror they've avoided for years. Let's go deeper, really deeper, because this is where the truth hurts them, more than it ever hurt you. They don't miss you at first. Not truly. Not honestly. They miss access. They miss comfort. They miss the version of you who always answered, always forgave, always checked in, always showed up even when they didn't. But after a while, something shifts. It's subtle at first. A thought, a memory, a moment where they reach for their phone and stop because you're not there anymore. Then it starts to grow and grow and grow until they can't outrun it anymore. Until the silence you left behind becomes something they can feel in their chest, in their routine, in their decisions, in their nights, in their mornings, in their loneliness. This is where they begin to understand. You weren't just someone. You were the difference. Not a moment, not an option, not a filler, not a phase. A difference. A difference in the way they slept. A difference in the way they dealt with stress. A difference in how loved they felt. Even when they didn't know how to love properly, they start to realize you gave them a version of affection they weren't mature enough to receive. You weren't too much. They were too limited. And when someone limited loses someone expansive, they feel it the hardest because they can't recreate you. They can't replace your energy. They can't duplicate your consistency. They can't mimic your presence. And that's when panic creeps in. Quietly, slowly, but deeply. They start replaying everything. Every conversation. Every misunderstanding. Every moment. They brushed you off. Every time. They thought you'd never leave. You become the ghost that follows them into every new connection. Not because you're haunting them, but because their conscience is. They compare, even when they don't want to, even when they pretend they're fine, even when they act unbothered. Everyone they meet feels a little duller, a little colder, a little less understanding, a little more temporary. Why? Because you weren't just a person. You were an emotional experience. And emotional experiences don't fade when the connection ends. They fade when the lesson is done. And they're not done learning from you. Not even close. Your value starts revealing itself in the areas where they now feel empty. Because that's the thing. Value isn't loud. Value is felt in the spaces where someone else can't fill in the gaps. They try to distract themselves. They try to keep busy. They try to convince themselves they didn't lose anything meaningful. But the truth keeps slipping through. During quiet nights, during long drives, during moments they don't post about, during conversations that don't feel the same, they start thinking, why did I let that go? Why didn't I try harder? Why didn't I respond differently? Why did I act like it didn't matter? Why did I assume they'd always be there? They don't just feel regret. They feel the weight of every decision they made from ego. Because the truth is, most people don't lose love. They lose the chance to experience love with someone who knew how to give it wholeheartedly. And that's what hits them the hardest. You love them in ways they didn't even know they needed. Until you stopped. There comes a moment, sometimes months later, sometimes years later, where it finally clicks for them. Not in a dramatic way, not in a movie scene moment, but in a quiet realization that cuts deeper than any argument ever did. You were the person they should have cherished when they had the chance. And that's the moment they understand your value, not because you reminded them, but because you walked away with dignity, with self-respect, with the kind of silence that speaks louder than begging ever could. They don't miss the old dynamic. They miss who they were when they were loved by you, because you made them better, even when they didn't deserve it. And now that you're gone, they're left with a version of themselves that doesn't feel as whole. The irony? People realize value the moment they're forced to live without it. Not because you punished them, not because you played games, not because you tried to teach them a lesson, but because you simply stopped giving what they kept taking for granted. Absence is the great revealer. It shows them who actually mattered, who was real, who was irreplaceable. And in your case, they realize it too late. Not because you were hard to love, but because they were unprepared to receive the kind of love that didn't ask them to shrink or hide or pretend. You showed up in ways that exposed their gaps. You loved in ways that exposed their fears. You gave in ways that exposed their emotional immaturity. So they ran, or they ghosted, or they avoided, or they minimized, or they sabotaged, not because you weren't enough, but because they weren't ready. And now, in your absence, they finally understand. You weren't the one who should have been fighting to stay. They were the one who should have been fighting to keep you. But they didn't. And now all that's left is the truth. They can't escape anymore. Losing you was the moment. They lost the version of themselves that felt safe, seen, and cared for. That's why they only realize your value when you're gone. Not because you became more valuable, but because they became more aware. And awareness always comes too late. For the ones who took love for granted. You know what's ironic? The moment someone realizes your value is always the moment when you've stopped waiting for them to realize anything at all. Because now, they're not watching someone who's hurt. They're watching someone who outgrew the version of them they used to depend on. And that's the part that hits them the hardest. Not losing you, but losing the access they thought they'd always have. Because in their mind, you were permanent, available, predictable, safe. You were the one who forgave the things you shouldn't have, who understood what no one else bothered to see, who stayed longer than someone with your worth should ever have stayed. And when people get used to your presence, they treat your consistency as if it comes with no cost. They assume your patience is endless, your softness is guaranteed, your loyalty is unconditional, your heart is unbreakable. But everything has a limit, even someone like you. And when you walked away, quietly, gracefully, without fireworks, without revenge, without screaming your pain to the world, that silence did something louder than your words ever could. Because silence is the language of finality, the language of, I've given enough, I've tried enough, I've heard enough, I deserve more than this. And they felt that shift. At first, they didn't take it seriously. People rarely do. They assume you'll come back because you always came back. They assume you're just upset because you always forgave. They assume the story isn't over because they couldn't imagine a version of life where you weren't orbiting their world. But then it hits them, slowly, painfully. Reality begins to creep in, like a cold truth. They can't ignore anymore. Your energy is no longer theirs. Your attention is no longer theirs. Your kindness is no longer theirs. Your loyalty is no longer theirs. And suddenly, they start replaying everything. The moments they dismissed, the times they pushed you away, the choices they made, when they thought you'd never leave. This is when regret overrides their pride, not because they suddenly became wiser, but because they finally understood what they lost: a rare soul, a steady heart, a love that didn't ask for perfection, only effort. Your absence becomes the mirror they've avoided for years, and in that reflection, they see the truth. You didn't leave because someone else replaced them. You left because you finally replaced the version of yourself who kept shrinking just to be enough for them. You stopped loving them more than you loved yourself. You stopped tolerating what your heart wasn't built to carry. You stopped begging for the bare minimum from someone who should have given you the world without being asked. And when that version of you disappeared, their version of love collapsed with it. Because the truth is, they only realize your value when you're gone, because they were never emotionally mature enough to value you when you were there. People like that don't appreciate light until they're sitting in the dark. They don't appreciate softness until life stops giving it to them. They don't appreciate love until the heart that held them so gently no longer beats for them. And here's what matters most. Your leaving wasn't punishment. It was protection. It was self-respect in motion. It was alignment. It was healing. It was destiny opening a door they were never meant to walk through with you. And deep down, you know this. You didn't lose them. They lost you. And they know it. They feel it. They live with it. And you? You're not the same person they remember. You've grown, evolved, expanded, reclaimed yourself, rebuilt your peace, recovered your worth. You are becoming the version of you they were too small to meet. And that's why your story isn't about who left. It's about who you're becoming. And the right people will never need to lose you to understand your value. If this spoke to your heart, if it felt like I was describing your story, then stay with this channel. There are so many more truths you deserve to hear. Your healing isn't done, but you're not walking it alone. Subscribe, stay close, and let's keep growing you into the person they only realized they wanted when it was too late.